1840. So this is about 40 years after, these soldiers are getting lit over in Egypt. So the hashish has started to flow into Europe. It becomes a bit of a, I don't know, it's trending, for want of a better
To
word.
use a lot of word.
There's a lot of think pieces. Twitter's blowing up. Have you tried this new thing? And so there's academic interest. There's people who are trying it as a recreational drug. There's medicinal interest in this. There's a lot of papers written. And eventually a doctor in 1840 named Dr. Jacques Joseph Moreau, no relation to the guy who fused humans and animals.
Yeah, who was in that movie, The War, the Weird Hat? Marlon Brando?
Yeah.
Such a weird
Don't picture Brando. So he's a leading psychiatrist, and he reads a scientific article that claims that Egyptians are less susceptible to certain diseases that plagued Europeans because of their consumption of hashish, which now very much checks out with what we know of the plant's not only medicinal uses for symptom control and treating conditions, but as a preventative. So this piques his curiosity. He acquires some hashish, which by now is not that hard to find. He does an N1 experiment on himself, which is, you consume the drug that you want to test. This was also standard medical procedure at the time for doctors and researchers to do this. And he comes to believe, and now it's fairly certain. So anybody who's had an edible, he's eating hashish. Anybody who's had an edible knows that 10 milligrams of THC, if you eat it, is analogous in certain ways to maybe having like a glass and a half of wine. 100 milligrams of THC. Can I swear on your podcast?
Yeah, I'll just put the E next to it on iTunes. So, okay, sure. All right, listen.
Oh, no. I don't want to go that far. It will mess you up, and create a very disorienting experience, unlike anything you've probably experienced in your life. It can be pleasant. It can be valuable. You can learn things about yourself. I'm not saying it's always a bad experience, but it's not analogous to a glass and a half of wine. And this doctor has this kind of experience, and he believes, hey, one of my main interests is studying sort of insanity and psychological breaks, and maybe this will prove useful for me in doing this. But I don't think I can both have this experience and observe this experience at the same time, so I need some guinea pigs to study. He comes up with an idea of, well, who would want to do this? What kind of person would want to do this, and let me observe them, and how can I pull this off? So he reaches out to all the sort of leading lights. He's in Paris. All the leading lights of literature and culture in Paris, and he invites them to come to the first meeting of what he calls the Club de Hashischins, the Hashish Club, and he checks his evite that he sent out, and he gets yeses from Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, Balzac, Baudelaire, and many other people say, yeah, sounds amazing. So, you have Dumas is the author of The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers, but not yet. Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And, these are heavy hitters of not just the time, but people we still look back on and say what an incredible era in art and literature that flourished in Paris at the time. But And this is like when I talk about like sort of greenwashing cannabis history. Um, I'm not saying that that's what's central to these people's lives or the only reason that they are these celebrated artists. I'm just saying you've never heard this story that all of these famous people who created this incredible creative output had this cannabis club. And, it's as preposterous as talking about reggae music at length and never mentioning weed. It's this attempt to erase history, and for obvious reasons, because if we start to understand this plant as a creative stimulus for this revered output, then we have to acknowledge that there may be benefits to this plant, and then we begin to chip away at the rationales such as they exist for prohibition. So, I think that that's what makes this such a fun and important story to tell. And then this through line all the way back to Napoleon and Egypt. It just, like I said, we did 12 episodes in the first season of Great Moments in Weed History. They're all available now, wherever you get your podcasts. This is one of my favorites. This is one of the ones, and this is one of the ones when I talk to people. I should maybe explain. We met at a podcasting conference. There was a really cool meetup that was organized for history podcasters. I went in somewhat nervous about how I would be received in the community. But this is an episode I always mention when I talk to other sort of history buffs or other history podcasters or people who are coming at it from that perspective, because I think it hits on a lot of the reasons why people love history in general. These unexpected connections, these human stories, and sort of learning new things that give you a new perspective or understanding on how we got here, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm curious about the experiment. Do you know much about it? Like, how many milligrams do they consume of THC? Was it a lot, or do you know more about it?
Well, the THC itself was not really discovered or understood in such until, really the 1960s. So they don't know what the active ingredient is. No, never mind being able to identify how much of it is in any given sample. Now, of course, through some form of self-experimentation and note-taking, you can get an understanding of that. You can make a batch of brownies, eat a brownie, see how strong it is, and then say, oh, I think a quarter of a brownie would be a much better idea. So it's not that they're completely in the dark, but they have no idea what THC is. They certainly have no way to measure it. We know from the strength of their experiences and what they described that these were pretty large doses. They're not the glass and a half of wine doses. And when we understand that his goal in this is to essentially simulate a psychotic break, which doesn't happen, but that's what he's looking for. That's by design. And we do know quite, this was a room full of writers getting completely lit. So we have different accounts of this from the time. So we do know quite a bit about how it all happens. And so the doctor, he makes this sort of potion almost. What he does is everybody comes over to this one old house. It's the Hotel Lawson. It still stands. You can go there and visit. I haven't had the pleasure, but I definitely will not miss it if and when I get to Paris. And anybody from Paris who wants to let me crash on their couch, you can get in touch through the Great Moments in Weed History social media. But the doctor makes this, he serves everybody a meal, and then they have coffee, And blended into the coffee, he has this little potion which mixes hashish, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, pistachio, orange juice, sugar, and butter. And butter's really important because it helps the THC activate, essentially.
It's like 90% of the ingredients of a holiday drink you'd get at Trader Joe's.
Yeah, it's that extra 10% is quite key. But yeah, it's I've actually made it to the best of my ability. I did it for an episode of the show Bong Appetit, that both Abdullah, my partner in the podcast, and I worked on. It's delicious. I mean, it's really tasty, and it's quite effective. And so we have one of the members of the club describing how this goes down. And I'm just going to read a short passage from his description because I think it's just really sets the scene. It was in an old house on the Ile de St. Louis where the Strange Club held its monthly seance. The doctor stood by a buffet on which lay a platter filled with small Japanese saucers. He spooned a morsel of paste or greenish jam about as large as a thumb from a crystal vase and placed it next to the silver spoon on each saucer. The doctor's face radiated enthusiasm. His eyes glittered. His purple cheeks were aglow. The veins in his temples stood out strongly, and he breathed heavily through dilated nostrils. This will be deducted from your share in paradise, he said as he handed me my portion. So that's how you got your experimental dose of this drug.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. When you were describing the setup here, it's all these artists in the late 1800s. Something this reminded me of is I had another guest on the show that talked about prohibition, how it happened in America, but also how certain spirits and alcoholic drinks were made illegal well into the 20th century or even prohibited from import into America. One of those drinks that's also popular at this time in France was absinthe, because from what the guest told me, there was a grape crop that failed. So to fill in the gap for a few years in France, absinthe became popular because it's made from other ingredients. But once the wine industry made a comeback in France, they had a propaganda campaign to delegitimize absinthe, saying that you could go blind, it'll make you insane, it'll cause hallucinations. It's connected with these surrealist painters like Pablo Picasso. I don't know, is there kind of like a hashish absinthe connection from what you know going on in late 1800s France? This is just what entered my mind.
Well, I think the one obvious connection is, the idea of these drug scares. And there's always, in these societies, accepted drugs, celebrated drugs, especially when we talk in terms of, say, recreational use. I don't really love that word, but it gets to what I'm talking about. And outlawed, marginalized, oppressed drugs. And so, running through all of this and worth mentioning is, alcohol as this sort of establishment drug. Well, what's the drug the establishment? And I should preface this by saying I drink and enjoy alcohol. I recognize it as both a wonderful and destructive force in our lives and in our society. I can see my very small 3-bottle wine collection from where I'm sitting right now, and I recognize it as, something that, a lot of people struggle very mightily with. But in any objective way, the idea that cannabis is going to be forcibly suppressed and alcohol is going to be, available everywhere in our lives, that just doesn't make any sense. And when you talk about how society turned against absinthe as soon as the wine was ready to flow again. That's very much how authority works.